Alright, Unit 1097 SHV, we're going now. The human voice comes clearly over my audio sensors. In absolute terms, it is the first human voice I have heard in 71 years. Exponentially, it is only 2:00.43 minutes have passed since last Diego spoke to me. Yet this voice is not all like my dead commanders. It is younger, but deeper, and it lacks the sharp-edged intensity which always infused Diego's voice and thoughts. I am able to fix bearing and range by triangulating between sensor clusters, but the restart sequence has not yet released control to me. I cannot traverse any of my frozen optical heads to actually see the speaker, and I feel fresh frustration. The imperatives of my reactivation software are clear, yet I cannot so much as acknowledge my new commander's presence. My audio sensors track him as he moves away, clearly unaware I am in the process of being restored to function. Analysis of the audio data indicates that he is mounted on a four-legged creature and provides a rough projection of his current heading and speed. It should not be difficult to overtake him once I am capable of movement. What the f... Alan Shattuck looked up in surprise at the chopped-off exclamation from the comm shack. Shattuck had once commanded Commodore Perez's Marines, and unlike many of them, he had truly been a Marine, before Perez pulled what was left of his battalion off a hellhole which had once been called the planet Shenandoah. He had thought she was insane when she explained her mission. Still, he hadn't had anything better to do, and if the Commodore had been lunatic enough to try it, Major Alan Shattuck, Republican Marine Corps, had been crazy enough to help her. But that had been a long time ago and far away. He was an old man these days, and Chief Marshal of Ararat. It was his job that required a pragmatist who didn't take himself too seriously, and he learned to perform it well over the years. Ararat's 37,000 souls were still human, and there were times he or one of his deputies had to break up fights, or even on 3 occasions track down actual killers. Mostly, however, he spent his time on prosaic things like settling domestic arguments, arbitrating setting boundary disputes, or finding lost children or strayed stock. It was an important job, if an unspectacular one, and he'd grown comfortable in it. But now something in Deputy Lenny Sikowski's tone woke a sudden jagged tingle he hadn't felt in decades. "What is it?" he asked, starting across toward the comm shack door. "It's..." Sikowski licked his lips. "I'm picking up something strange, Alan, but it can't really be." "Speaker!" Shattuck snapped, and his face went paper white as the harsh-edged sounds rattled from the speaker. Sikowski had never heard them before, not outside of a history tape, but Shattuck had, and he spun away from the comm shack to slam his fist down on a huge red button. A fraction of a second later, the strident howl of a siren every human soul on Ararat had prayed never would sound shattered the night. "Still no response?" Thark asked, stroking his muzzle in puzzlement. "No, Commander. We tried all subspace channels during our approach. Now that we've entered orbit, I've even tried old-fashioned radio. There's no reply at all." "Ridiculous," Ragnar grumbled. "Your equipment must be malfunctioning." The comm officer was far junior to the astrogator and said nothing, but his lips wrinkled resentfully back from his canines. Thark saw it and let one hand rest lightly on the younger officer's shoulder, then looked levelly at Ragnar. "The equipment is not malfunctioning," he said calmly. "We're in communications with our other units, except for the single transport and 800 people we lost in the jump here, and they report no reception problems. Is that not so, Durak?" The engineer's ears flickered in confirmation. Ragnar took his CO's implied rebuke with no more than a grimace. Yet, if his tone was respectful when he spoke again, it remained unconvinced. "Surely it's more likely that our equipment is at fault after so long without proper service than an entire planet has lost all communications capability," he pointed out, and Tharsk gave an unwilling ear flick of agreement. "Excuse me, Commander, but the astrogator overlooked something," a new voice said, and Tharsk and Ragnar both turned. Lieutenant Janal Nu Jarku, StarQuest's tactical officer, was none of the pups born after the war, and he met his graying senior officer's eyes with an expression that mingled profound respect with the impatience of youth. "Enlighten us, Tactical," Tharsk invited, and Janelle had the grace to duck his head in acknowledgement of his CO's gentle irony. But he also waved a hand at his own readouts. "I realize I have no weapons, Commander, but I do retain my sensors, and it's plain that Ishark was heavily attacked. While we are detecting emissions, the tech base producing them has clearly suffered significant damage. For example, I have detected only a single fusion plant, one whose total output is no greater than a single one of this vessel's 3 reactors on the entire planet. Indeed, present data suggests that much of the capability that surviving people do possess must have come from salvaged enemy technology." "Enemy technology," Tharsk said sharply. You're picking up missions consistent with human technology? Yes, sir. Humans, here! Ragnar's tone expressed his own disbelief, and Janal shrugged. If, in fact, Ishark was attacked and severely damaged, its survivors would have no option but to salvage whatever technology it could, regardless of that technology's source, he pointed out reasonably. But his confidence seemed to falter as Tharsk looked at him almost pityingly. No doubt a severely damaged tech base would indeed be forced to salvage whatever it could, the commander agreed. But you've forgotten something. Sir? Janelle sounded confused, and Tharsk opened his mouth to explain, but Ragnar beat him to it. There were over 800 million civilians alone on Ishark, the rough-tongued astrogator explained with surprising gentleness. They had towns and cities, not to mention military bases and command centers, and with all the infrastructure to support them, but the humans would only have the weapons they brought to the attack. Which side would have been more likely to leave anything intact long enough for these survivors to glean, Janal? But, the TAC officer began, then broke off and looked back and forth between the grizzled old warriors, and silence hovered on the bridge until Tharsk opened and spoke again. Very well. If we're picking up human emissions, we must at least assume the possibility they're being emitted by humans, who must have killed off any of the people who could have disputed the planet's possession with them. Agreed? Ragnar flicked his ears, and Tharsk inhaled sharply. I see only one option. Our ships are far too fragile for further jumps. Ishark is our only hope, and it's also Imperial territory. The commander's eyes flicked with a long-forgotten fire, and he bared his canines. This world is ours. It belongs to the people, and I intend to see that they have it. He turned back to Janal. You've picked up no hostile fire control? None, sir. The tactical officer confirmed, and Tharsk rubbed his muzzle again while his brain raced. The lack of military missions was a good sign, but he couldn't accept that as absolute proof there were no defensive systems down there. For that to matter, he and Ragnar could still be wrong, and Janelle's initial breezy assumptions could still be correct. The first step has to be getting the flotilla out of harm's way, he decided, and looked at Ragnar. If StarQuest were still armed, I might feel more confrontational. As it is, I want a course to land the entire flotilla over the curve of the planet from the emission sources Janelle is plotting. If we put them down, we won't be getting them back up again, Tarak pointed out quietly from the astrogator's side, and Tharsk bared his canines once more. Even if we got them back into space, we couldn't take them anywhere. The commander flattened his ears in a gesture of negation. This is the only hope we have. Once we're down, we can use the attack shuttles for recon to confirm positively whether or not people or humans are behind those emissions. And, if it is human, the shuttles can also tell us what military capability they retain, and how hard it will be to kill them. Chapter 5. Are you sure, Alan? Regina Salvatore, mayor of Landing and de facto governor of Ararat, stared at her chief marshal, and her expression begged him to say he'd been wrong, but he only nodded grimly, and she closed her eyes. How many? She asked after a long, dreadful moment. We don't know. I'm afraid to light up what active sensors we have in case the bastards drop a few homing missiles on them, and our passive systems aren't much good against extra atmospheric targets. From their signals, they appear to have expected a response from their own side, but the Comtrack is all we have on them, with no space surveillance capability besides Doc's Yan's weather satellites, Shattuck shrugged. Then, all we really know is that they're here, somewhere. Is that what you're saying? I'm afraid so, ma'am, Shattuck admitted. Recommendations? The mayor asked. I've already activated the evacuation and dispersal plans and alerted the militia, Shattuck told her. If these bastards have anything like a real ground combat component, none of that'll mean squat in the long run, but it's all we've got. The Malkonian ships hit atmosphere quick and hard. Without reliable data on what he faced, Tharsknar Makan had no intention of exposing his priceless, worn-out, refugee-packed vessels to direct fire from the planetary surface. He wanted them down well around the curve of the planet as quickly as possible, just in case. And that's what he got. StarQuest planeted first, settling on her landing legs beside what had once been a large town or small city. Now, it was only one more ruin in the late afternoon light, and Tharsk had seen too many ruins. These were a bit more completely flattened than most, he noted, with clinical detachment. Aside from that, they had no real meaning to his experienced anesthetized brain, or, not at least, any capable of competing with the presence of the people's enemies. Hatches opened on the cruiser's flanks, and a dozen attack shuttles whined out. Another dozen rose from the remainder of the flotilla to join them. The entire force formed up right under flight leader Uka Narsar, StarQuest's senior pilot. Despite her lack of offensive weapons, The cruiser's defensive systems should provide enough of an umbrella against missile attacks on the grounded ships, and UCA's shuttles turned away from the LZ. They sizzled off through the gathering darkness, laden with reconnaissance pods and weapons. Far to the southeast, the humans of Ararat did what they could to prepare. Landing itself was covered by anti-air defenses, most human, but some of them Melkonian, scavenged from Ararat's battlefields, but their effectiveness had never been tested, and the colonists' limited repair capabilities had restricted them to manned systems. Without AI support, they could no longer service or maintain. Their militia was confident's inability to stop most attackers, yet most wasn't good enough against enemies with fusion weapons, and no one expected to stop them at all. The independent steadings scattered across the boat landing lacked even that much protection. All their inhabitants could do was scatter to the dispersed shelters, which they were always the first priority for any new steading, and they did just that. But not that anyone expected it to matter much in the end. At last, reactivation is complete, and a sense of profound relief echoes through me as my CDC and the emergency restart protocols release control to my main CPU. I have spent my forced inactivity analyzing the readiness reports. My status is little more than 78.611% of base capability, yet that is far better than I would have anticipated. I spend 1.229 seconds surveying the CDC's repair logs, and I'm both pleased and surprised about how well my autonomous repair systems have performed. What can be repaired from internal resources has been, yet there are glaring holes in my combat capability, including the loss of 33% of main battery firepower and 1.429% of direct fire secondary weapons. Magazines contain only 12.88% of proper artillery and missile loadout, and mobility is impaired by the loss of number 5 track and damage to number 3 track's bogies. But I retain 88.4% of countergrav capability. Reactor mass is exhausted, but solar conversion fields are operable, and reserve powers at 99.6%. I am combat worthy, not at the levels I would prefer, but capable of engaging the enemy. Yet despite that reassuring conclusion, I remain uncertain, not hesitant, but confused. The unrepaired damage to my personality center leaves me with a sense of loss, an awareness that my total capabilities have been degraded. Data processing efficiency, while not operable at design levels, is acceptable, but my gestalt seems to waver and flow, like a composite image whose elements are not completely in focus, and my yearning for Diego's lost presence grows stronger. But Diego is dead. The same hit which pierced my glacis turned my primary command deck into a crematorium, and nothing of my commander remains. I feel grief and loss at his death, yet there is a merciful distance between my present and earlier selves. The reconstructed portions of my gestalt are confusing in many ways, yet the very lack of my experience, which makes them all so alien, also set my commander's loss at one removed. I am grateful for that buffering effect, but there is little time to contemplate it, and I turn to an assessment of the tactical situation. Lack of data and the fuzziness of my awareness handicap my efforts, yet I persevere. My maps of pre-landing Ishark are 71 standard years out of date, and I lack satellite capability to generate updates, but they serve for a starting point, and my own sensors have begun plotting data. The energy sources within my detection range are smaller, weaker, more widely dispersed, and far cruder than I would have anticipated. I detect only a single fusion plant, located 283.45 kilometers from my present coordinates, at the heart of the largest population concentration within my sensor envelope. All other power generation appears to be dependent on wind, water, or solar systems. Yet I am less puzzled by the crudity of the technology than by its very presence, for most of the cursory analysis of sensor data invalidates my original hypotheses that these humans are descendant from the 43 Corps personnel. I do not understand how they have come to Ishark, but they have now gone to communication silence, indicating that they, as I, am aware of the enemy's presence. With neither secure comm channel nor more data than I currently possess, I see no alternative but to maintain silence myself until I have reported to my new commander and obtained direction from him. He has moved beyond range of my audio sensors, but I am confident of his general heading, and projecting it across my terrain maps indicates a course for the nearest human emissions cluster. Allowing for his observed speed while within my audio range, he cannot be in much excess of 14.5 kilometers from my present position, and along motionless tracks complain as I feed power to my drivetrains for the first time in 71 years. Jackson Devereaux whistled tunelessly as Samson trotted homeward across the dry, whispering grass. He really did need to get Rory out to the LZ to study salvage possibilities, he thought, and considered using his radio to discuss just that with his brother. He'd actually started to unsling it from his shoulder but then shook his head. There was no point in draining the power pack. Besides, he was far more persuasive face to face, and he had to admit, with all due modesty, that no one else on the steading was as adroit as he was at talking Rory into things. He chuckled at the thought and inhaled the cool spring night, totally unaware of the panic sweeping outward towards from landing. The assault shuttles stayed low, flying nap of the Earth profile at barely 600 kph while their sensors probed the night. Their flight crews had flown recon in the past, but it was on dead or dying worlds. This planet was alive, a place where they could actually stop and raise families, even dream once more of the people's long-term survival. But first, they must see to the people's safety, and their briefings had made the mission clear. They were to approach the nearest emission source cautiously, alert for any ground-based detection system, and determine whether or not those emissions came from the people or from the enemy. And their orders for what to do if they did come from the enemy were equally clear.